One bed flat, and we're just west of London, so you're probably looking about 250,000. Landlords have sort of picked up on the fact that the younger generation in particular can't really afford to get on the property market, so the rental market has boomed because of it, and more landlords are just buying up stock all over the place and knowing that they can achieve the rents that they're asking. Generally speaking, especially around Surrey, even for a small flat, you're probably looking at about £1,000 a month. You look at 2 years worth of rent, that's money you're not going to get back. So I think this is an area which is within reach for younger generations. Admittedly, it's not for everybody. Some people don't like the idea of living in what they consider a shed, although it's not if you see one inside. But it's helping out a lot of people. Tiny houses is a concept that originated in the States about 10 years ago or so. I first saw it about 7 years back and thought it was a good idea, but the timing just wasn't really right. About 5 years ago, I mean, you've got so many things happening in the news about affordable housing and so on. I thought this would just be an ideal solution to quite a lot of problems that are out there at the moment. So started off with building the first one, which is a bit of a learning curve, I must admit. But now, there's so much interest coming in. It's really grown in the last few years, and still a lot of people don't even know what a tiny house is. We build them here in our workshop. Most of the time they're out of timber, and they're built in the same way as a loft conversion, I suppose, on a house. Tried and tested through building control and general building methods. We know it works, but again, we've got to keep an eye on the weight and so on. Insulation, exactly the same as a house. So we know they're warm. The whole point of them is to make them feel you are actually in a property rather than in a shed or anything like that. The mobile tiny houses, they're a little bit tricky because obviously you're up against a weight situation with the chassis. So the idea is to build them as small as possible, really, and to make as much use of that space as you can. Little things like the ladder system could then be used as shelves. So everything really has to have a double use, ideally. The sofa bench doubles up as a nest of tables that then slides out, plus storage inside them. So it still feels quite spacious. We found that people like the idea, like the way they're designed and built, but they wanted them larger and they didn't necessarily want them on wheels. So we ended up building them probably 3 times the size. They are generally bespoke built. The mobile ones are probably a little bit more expensive per square foot just because of they're built on a chassis and you've got to be careful about the weight and so on. But cost-wise, roughly speaking, I suppose about 25 to 30,000, depending on spec, depending on what you want inside. Lights, for instance, you get cheap lights and you can get very expensive lights. A lot of people want the off-grid idea where it's not really going to cost them too much in ongoing bills and so on, and be able to live using solar power or wind turbines or whatever. Technology's there, it is quite expensive. Solar power in particular, all very well and good, but they can only hold so much power in the battery, so you've got to be really careful about what you're doing, what lights you've got on, what power bulb do you have in there. You've got to be very conscious about how much power you're using. You look at things like ovens and so on, you think, well, you can't have an oven in there because that's just going to take power straight away. So you've got to look at other alternatives, so camping stoves or using gas or something like that. You want to be boiling water as well and storing it somewhere so you've got hot water readily available without having to do a separate boil just to get hot water. I think people see the American dream and buy a little bit of land next to a lake or in some woodland and just live there happily ever after. It's not as easy as that. Part of the problem, which is sort of stopping this movement as you're moving forward, is the legalities behind it. I think people say, well, because it's on wheels, you don't need planning permission. But in effect, if you're living in a tiny house or a cardboard box, you should have planning permission because it's residential. And it's more about the land that it's sitting on. If the logistics was there and if the planning issues were there, then you'd have things like tiny house villages. I looked into one particular council at how much council-owned land which was effectively not being used. One in particular was probably about 3 miles away from quite a large university, which was effectively wasteland, and there was 4 horses on it, and that's probably a good 20 odd acres. Now that says to me, okay, why don't we do something there? A bit like dorms, the students are getting quite large student loans. If you were to have a tiny house which you could effectively be yours, you can live in it, at the end of that term, at least you've actually got something to sell on to the next student. So then these students wouldn't be walking into the big wide world with massive debts over them to start with. It just gives people a start, definitely a start in life.